All right, we're so lucky to have with us today Jason Cardiff. He's the CEO and founder of CleanO2 capture technology up in Canada. Thank you so much for being with us today, Jason.
Hey, thanks for having me.
I think we heard about you from one of our fans sent us a video about your company, and I learned a bit about you, and I was like, we have to interview Jason because you do something really cool. Can you tell us about this machine, the Carbon X, that you've made?
Sure. Yeah. So it's a modular device that goes into a mechanical room where the building uses natural gas as an energy source for heat. And the technology that we've developed diverts a portion of the greenhouse gases into our system where we convert it into a chemical that can be used in multiple of different industries. And primarily, we're just focused on soaps and detergents right now. So, we've got our own line of personal care products that we make out of recycled carbon.
So, you have a box, a special magic box. It's not magic. You designed it.
It's a scientific box.
And so it goes in a mechanical room. You mean like in a large building?
Yeah. So some of our customers are like condominium complexes, schools, rec centers, assisted living complexes, hotels is another great one. So those are kind of the scale of buildings that we typically look at.
And so what does it do? Because I mean, basically, it's going to be right next to some kind of a heater that uses natural gas or something that burns natural gas. So like what goes in and what comes out?
Sure. Yeah. So every time the gas-fired appliance turns on, you combust natural gas, which of course is creating this issue with greenhouse gases. And typically, of course, those greenhouse gases are then vented to atmosphere. So what our technology does is we divert that greenhouse gas into our system, and it's exposed to potassium hydroxide. That potassium hydroxide loves CO2. It absorbs the CO2 and converts the hydroxide into a carbonate. That carbonate then is used for these other processes and products that we manufacture. Now, during that shift from a hydroxide to a carbonate, it's exothermic in nature. So we take the waste heat from the gas-fired appliance, combine it with the exothermic heat from the chemistry, and then we store that energy to reduce the amount of natural gas that's needed to meet the heating needs for that building. So we actually reduce greenhouse gases through two means. One, through energy offset and maximizing efficiencies. And then we also convert those greenhouse gases into a commodity that can be sold. So we're kind of double dipping in terms of means of reducing emissions from buildings.
But hang on, I thought natural gas appliances took a greenhouse gas like methane, burned it, and when you were done, you just had like water vapor or something. Like what? Right?
No. So when you take CH4 or a hydrocarbon and you burn it, the main component out of that is carbon dioxide. So that carbon dioxide is what's creating the issues with climate change. And methane obviously has a higher profile in terms of its effect on climate change, but CO2 there's an ample amount of it, too much of it, in fact. So once again, our purpose, our focus is to take that CO2 component post-combustion and convert it, permanently sequester it into this commodity that we manufacture.
Okay, so you're turning the CO2 exhaust gases into potassium carbonate, and then you can turn that into soaps, and you've been turning them into soaps.
Which we have, by the way.
Yeah.
You sent us some.
So what happens? So I take the soap and I wash my hands, or I wash my body, or I wash my dog. And then is that when then the CO2 escapes?
No, of all the questions I get asked, that is the most common question, is what happens to the CO2 after I use the bar of soap? And it is permanently sequestered. The best comparison that I can think of, I don't know if you're familiar with the salt flats in Utah.
Yeah, we almost got stuck there once in Sparky, remember?
Yes.
Nice. Great place to race. Anyway, it's sort of the same principle that you have salt that dissolves in water, and then when the water evaporates, you're left with the salt. The carbonate in your bar soap is the same thing. It dissolves in the water, but the moment that water evaporates, you're still left with the carbonate. And you can actually see examples of that on riverbeds. If you've ever gone for a walk down a riverbed and you'll see little sort of white scale components on pebbles, that's probably calcium carbonate or magnesium carbonate, but it's readily found in nature. So we're not adding something that isn't already there. And it doesn't get released back into the atmosphere. In fact, I guess if you were to take your bar of soap and throw it in your campfire, then I guess theoretically you could probably release your CO2. Or if you were to throw it in a giant vat of acid, then I guess you could release your CO2. But if you have time to do that with your bar of soap, I would say you probably have too much time on your hands.
Sure. So it's different than other forms of sequestration. I mean, I think of like soda, for example. They take CO2 and they put it into they carbonate your beverage, and then you drink it. And at some point, most of that carbonate is going to be burped back out into the atmosphere. But with this, you're saying it's changing it from carbon dioxide into, it's actually going through a chemical process and is becoming a salt.
Exactly. Yes, it does not. And we do that with, like, there's other products that we're looking at launching later this year, like fertilizers, binding agents for textiles. We look at things where that doesn't happen, where the CO2 isn't processed in some form or fashion and then released back to atmosphere. We're trying to permanently sequester everything that we capture in these various goods that we're making.
Okay, but why didn't you just make some fully electric or solar powered heater or something like that? Why it seems like a bit of a rigmarole to burn something and then to capture the CO2. Just make an electric heater, and why don't we just do that? Wouldn't that be cheaper and easier?
Not necessarily. I'm glad you asked that. Specifically in the retrofit market, the energy intensity needed to keep our older buildings warm is really intensive. And it is very challenging at the current state of technology to do that with an electron. The energy density of methane is sufficient enough to keep our older buildings warm. I think if I was to look in the crystal ball and see where the markets are going to head for heating, specifically in the retrofit market, I would say that the easiest path is probably through hydrogen. Now, it's not without its own problems, significant problems, but when you look at the existing infrastructure that's there, if we want to talk about rapid decarbonization, speaking from somebody who's been in the industry for over 20 years, hydrogen just makes a lot more sense because of energy density and the requirements of a building and where the technology readiness level is for larger commercial buildings. I can see for like your small homes, heat pump technology makes a lot of sense. But in the commercial settings, in the larger buildings, specifically older buildings, heat pumps, not quite there yet. And it tends to be a little bit expensive. So maybe we'll get there one day. But we need to start addressing carbon emissions today. We can't wait another decade or 20 years to start taking action on things. So, it's not perfect, but at least it's a step that we can take today.
So if I'm a school or, another large commercial building, first of all, how much does CarbonX cost to install? And then why would I want to install it? Like, what's the incentive for me as that school?
Yeah. When we built the technology, all along the way, we were sort of asking ourselves, like, why would you put one of these in? It's, if you don't care about greenhouse gases and all you care about is your operating expenditures, why would you bother putting in this modular device in your building? So we're very mindful in creating a business model that made sense regardless of your stance on climate change and carbon emissions. And so we start with energy efficiency. So if you're running natural gas in your building and you need to reduce your operating expenditures for the utilities that you plug into that building, you can do that with our system because we are an economizer. So we lower the amount of gas that you need. We also provide a really cool mechanism that with that commodity that we produce, we sell that on the open market, and then we cut a rebate back to the customer. So we actually profit share with the customer so that they're making money off of this equipment in their mechanical room as well. So they get a quick return on their investment for the initial upfront, which is unlike any other piece of HVAC equipment out there. You buy a boiler or a hot water tank, you get 20 years out of it, and then you have to buy another one. In our system, we work really hard with each customer to get that money back to them very quickly through our rebate structure of selling that commodity and then sharing in that revenue with the customer.
Wait, so it's almost like I'm mining for potassium carbonate. Like if I have this system installed in my building, I'm getting this new thing that I could never have gotten before. And wait, I'm getting to profit share off that? Like I get a part of the profit of the soaps?
Yeah, to hasten that return on the investment. We call it urban mining. So basically the customer is purchasing the mining equipment and you give us the right of way to operate it. And we go out and take what we've mined out of your flue stream, we sell it. And then right now we're paying $1.20 Canadian per kilo of pearl ash or potassium carbonate produced from each unit. And our current version will do between 3,000 to 4,000 kilos per year. Our next version should be more than double that. While staying within the existing footprint of the size of the unit.
Now, you were saying that there is stuff that goes into this unit in order to make it work. What was it again? It was potassium hydroxide?
Yeah, potassium hydroxide, yeah.
That sounds like a chemical. Sounds like I don't like it. That sounds too big a word. What is it? Is it toxic? Like, what if it spills or it oozes out, or what if some kids get in it? Is it bad? Is it some awful stuff?
It could be. The interesting thing that the genesis of this process came from hearing about a university that was using hydroxides for direct air capture. And I realized that this chemical that they were talking about, it was sodium hydroxide. We use sodium hydroxide to neutralize acidization of boilers. So when we're trying to descale a boiler, we'll run hydrochloric acid through the boiler to get rid of all of the junk that builds up inside the heat exchanger, and then we'll plug sodium hydroxide as to neutralize that acid because it's a base. And I had heard this article of somebody who was using this chemical to capture CO2 from the air. And I thought, oh, well, isn't that interesting? Because I happen to have some in my basement. So we sort of started working on creating this platform based on using this chemical to capture carbon. Where we're different is that we use dry chemicals or anhydrous chemicals. So if I was to spill anhydrous hydroxide on your floor, well, that's not great. But it's pretty easy to clean up. I can sweep it up with a broom. I can file a report with it, and we can move ahead fairly quickly in terms of containing that spill. If it was liquid, well, that's a different matter. If I've poured liquid hydroxide on any surface, it's going to damage it. You run the risk of hurting somebody. So yeah, there is an issue with that. So we only process dry chemicals for safety reasons. And these are chemicals that are currently used in the heating industry already.
Okay. But I mean, you have to buy potassium hydroxide. How are you making money if you have to buy something and then you're just selling it, but it's slightly different? Is there a profit margin on that?
There is. What's interesting about potassium carbonate is that there is typically always going to be an energy input to create this chemical. So typically, what you will see is potash mines, like the ones we have up here in Canada. They'll mine potassium chloride. They'll take that potassium chloride, they'll put it into a slurry. That slurry will then run through an electrolytic process, and they'll get rid of the chlorine gas and the hydrogen, and then they're left with KOH, or potassium hydroxide. That potassium hydroxide is then shipped somewhere where they'll process it by burning natural gas for its CO2 component, and they'll aerate that through potassium hydroxide to get the potassium carbonate, and then those are used for various industries. In our case, yes, we're burning natural gas, but we're burning natural gas that you used to heat your home rather than dedicated natural gas specifically for this purpose. So for every 1 ton of potassium carbonate produced through traditional means, you will generate roughly 2.38 metric tons of CO2. In our instance, there's no CO2 because we're using a waste stream. I shouldn't say there's no CO2. Obviously, you're generating CO2 for the purposes of creating heat for your home. The difference being is that CO2 is going to either come into our process where we can capture it, or it's going to get vented to atmosphere. So even by that action, we're not only capturing CO2 and reducing it on site, we're also offsetting additional CO2 that would otherwise be generated through traditional processes.
So with the potassium carbonate that these units generate, it's not being like piped to your facility, you have to send somebody out to go collect it, I'm assuming, right?
Correct. So that's a great comment, because then you're implying that I'm going to hop in my internal combustion engine vehicle and I'm going to drive to this location, and I'm going to combust and create GHGs to get to that location, and then I'm going to collect this chemical, and I'm going to hop back in my ICE and drive somewhere else, and then it's going to get trucked all over the place. And that's a fair comment. What I would counter with, though, is that because we're dealing with commercial locations, that's already occurring. Unlike the furnace in your house, where you're reactive, right? The furnace fails, you call a plumber up, he comes in, or she comes up and fixes it and hands you a bill, and away you go. In a commercial setting, you have to have preventative maintenance measures on an ongoing basis. Imagine for a moment a hotel at 9 o'clock at night goes down, they don't have any hot water. It's not just one family that's not happy, it's hundreds of people that are not happy. So because there's that ongoing preventative maintenance that occurs in these buildings that we operate in, we just simply say, well, look, you're already there. We'll hire you, we'll pay you to do this collection process. It only takes about 30 minutes to do. And then when you go back to your shop, because you got to go there anyway, you drop this stuff off. And once you amass a certain volume, then we arrange to have it picked up and brought to a company that has to order this chemical in anyway for this process that they're using. So that's not to say that we're not acknowledging or trying to greenwash the idea of negating the carbon emissions associated with logistics, but we feel it's a fair thing to say that if somebody is already going there, we're just asking them to do one more job while they're there, that it at least minimizes the I guess it would be what scope 2 emissions that we would be referring to during our process.
And I mean, I think that most people watching this channel are under the opinion that fleets are going to be changing over to electric vehicles pretty soon. Yeah. And that would fall right within that same vein. So let me just ask, like, how frequently do you have to change it? I'm assuming it's based on use, but like, let's say it's in the middle of the winter and there's a lot of heating going on. How much, how often do you have to kind of come in and do that maintenance?
The average right now is about every 2 weeks.
Okay.
2-3 weeks on average. Yeah. So it ties in, once again, nicely with, usually preventative maintenance is like every week to 2 weeks. So we're every 2 to 3 weeks. So it kind of, there's an overlay there in terms of when they can go and do the collection. We have an IoT platform built into our system too, so it tells us. So we don't want to waste somebody's time going there and checking in on the batch and saying, oh, no, it's not ready for collection, so I've now wasted my time. We have the unit tell us when it's ready for collection, so that way we can be as efficient as we possibly can. Getting back to the electric vehicle, though, I would say if you're talking to Elon, tell him he needs to come up with a Tesla cargo van.
Yeah, a lot of people want that.
A lot of people do.
Yeah. I mean, imagine the Cybertruck is a cyber van. That's going to be cool.
Awesome. A little bit taller. Perfect.
Okay, so this is a unit, and it's about the size of like 2 refrigerators, and it's in a mechanical room. It's not in the front lobby.
Although it should be. I think that would be pretty cool.
Okay. But like, why put it in the building? Why not just put it outside and bring in some CO2 from the atmosphere? I mean, there's CO2 in the atmosphere, right?
Yeah, it's concentrations. I mean, would you rather deal with 400 or 500 parts per million, or would you rather deal with 40 or 50,000 parts per million? It's much easier to capture concentrated sources of GHGs than ambient GHGs. That's not to discount direct air capture or any activities in the carbon capture market. I think they're all equally important at this stage. But for us, and given my background in history, it's just a natural fit for us to move into a space that we're very familiar with. As I said, I've been in this industry for over 20 years, so I know mechanical rooms fairly intimately, and we can do some pretty remarkable things within that room. You could, though, I guess if you wanted to, you could put it outside. We have an instance for a cosmetics company where they're using it as an ambient scrubber with really low concentrations of CO2, and it works. It works quite well. It's just not that it's not designed for that.
Can I ask you about your background and kind of the story of how you founded this company and where you got this idea?
Sure. Yeah. This was largely just a case of me wanting to know where my career was going. As a plumber and gas fitter, I saw a lot of conversations going on around the concerns with greenhouse gas emissions. And I knew that roughly 70% of the market share here in Canada belonged to natural gas heating appliances. So I thought, okay, well, if they're making a public awareness campaign around emissions coming from the energy sector and the transportation industry, how long is it going to be before they start looking at smaller aggregated sources of GHGs? And I thought, well, it's probably not that far off in the future. So I thought, well, if my career is going to change, I should probably be prepared for that. So I started asking a lot of questions with manufacturers and regulators, and nobody really seemed to know. Nobody had a clear answer. I think the only clear answer I got from any of them was just maximize efficiencies of gas-fired heating appliances, which is important. We should all be as efficient as we possibly can. But even if you're 98% efficient, you're still using natural gas, and therefore you are still producing GHGs. So there was this unanswered piece of saying, okay, well, electrification probably isn't going to work for northern communities in the foreseeable future just because of the energy density, which means we're likely still going to need to use natural gas for as long as I'm alive. But we need to deal with greenhouse gases. So I thought, okay, well, if nobody has a clear answer, nobody can give me any steerage in terms of where my career should go, maybe there's an opportunity to create something. So yeah, for the better part of, I think the first 10 years of the project since 2005, it was just trial and error and trying not to blow my house up and, all of the typical things you see in a mad scientist basement. And here we are 16 years later with the world's first commercialized microscale carbon capture system. It's fully commercialized. It's got standards associated with it. And it's just been one error after another of learning how to refine this technology that we've developed to create value.
That sounds like a really intense pathway that you're on there, like years and years of figuring stuff out. What is that like to go from, a good paying job, I'm sure, to starting a company where I'm assuming you have to pour a lot of money into research and development?
Imagine, if you will, your stereotypical plumber showing up at a carbon capture conference that's focused on large emitters. And the scientists in the room are all wondering why you're there. Some of them are even pointing at the bathroom saying, well, the plumber should be in the bathroom fixing the leaky tap, not at the conference. So there was a few awkward sort of eyebrow-raising moments in the history of asking, why I was trying to pursue this. I recall one scientist at a conference that I attended said that the carbon markets will never mature, but how I choose to spend my time is my business. I thought, well, that's an interesting stance to take, considering the conference we were at. But there was many times when I go for weeks, sometimes months without a paycheck. I'm married. I have a mortgage. I've got a son who is also very innovative. So, you're putting not only yourself at risk, but your family at risk. So, but that's the joys of startups, right? That's kind of part and parcel.
Wow. I remember hearing from your story that your dad had a lot to do with why you're doing what you're doing. Can you tell me a bit about that?
Yeah, my dad's pretty cool. I realize my opinion's biased, but ever since I was a kid, he was always building stuff. He was always making things, whether it was automotive or whether it was some new door lock system that he had developed, or he was always in the garage. He was always making something. I always thought that was really cool, that not only could you make something, but that somebody else thought it was cool and that they would use it to make their lives better or more efficient in some way. So I think I took a lot of that to heart. He helps out at the shop here still, building things for us and helping us with innovative processes that we need to overcome. And he's had a huge amount of influence in my life.
I feel like that tinkering in the garage is this underrated skill set, because it's getting your brain to start processing that you are a problem solver. You are an engineer from a young age. Like, even before we call it that, if you're out in the garage doing whatever, you're solving problems. And so your brain is just like, oh, if there's this problem, I think I know how to solve it. And I know the tools to use, or the tools I'll need to solve it.
And no one else will solve it for me, right? Because I'm in the garage.
I was listening in on a podcast. I can't remember which one it was, but they had a guest on. He was a professor at a university, and it was this one little soundbite that stuck in my head. And he says, we shouldn't be asking kids what they want to be when they grow up. We should be asking them what problems do they want to solve. Just reframing that whole notion of what we're trying to put our kids into to go out and be successful or have meaning in their lives. It's like not just go become a lawyer because it sounds cool to be a lawyer or an engineer or a doctor. It's, I want to go out and I want to solve this problem. I want to solve the problem with space travel, or I want to solve the problem with environmental issues.
Right, because you went from being a plumber to being the CEO of a company. It's usually not the path.
No, generally speaking, no.
But in this case, it worked.
It did. It seems to have worked, yeah.
And it seems to be a common thread with a lot of CEOs that do well. You had a certain amount of naivete, if I can say it nicely, where you probably didn't think it would. I mean, well, tell me, did you think it would take this long?
No, God, no.
So if I had told you, like, as a magician back when you started this, like, it will take you 16 years, would you have done it?
Knowing me, yeah, I think I probably would have still done it. Yeah, it's, I am like a dog in a bone. I can't seem to let things go until I know that they've been resolved. And quite in honesty, I think if somebody else had come along earlier and had solved this problem, I probably would be less interested to pursue this as far as I have. But it's still a problem. It's still there. We still have 20% of the emissions in Canada come from this scale of appliances. It's 12% in the US and 7% globally. And there's very few working on it. So if we had, gone back 10 years ago and somebody had come and said, I've got the perfect solution, I'd be like, okay, well, I guess I'll go back to being a plumber.
Well, let's talk about that for a second, because you started this company, which very few people are working on. You just kind of made a new space for yourself, which is disruptive. And that's why we're talking to you. And so I want to know, what's the future of this company? Like, what are you looking to do in the future? Is it going to be mainly selling soap? Is it mainly going to be selling Carbon X? Is it both? Like, where's this company going?
Yeah, ultimately we're building two businesses right now, but out of necessity. During the early days of the company, we had just wanted to be a commodity player where the technology produced a commodity and we sold a commodity and we washed our hands of it, pun intended. But what we found was because of the volumes of commodity that we were producing, it was difficult to create that traction that we needed to have people sort of turn on the light and get what it was that we were doing. So we ended up creating this almost separate enterprise where we produced stuff, and in this case, it's soap. So we're building two businesses, but as we move forward, I can see a time where we hand off that consumer goods over to a Procter and Gamble or an SC Johnson or a Method or whoever, and have the experts scale that appropriately. We'll probably always do something in-house, but I can see that kind of being shaved off so that we can focus just on the technology. And in terms of where we see things going from a technology standpoint, our goal is to decarbonize the heating industry by whatever means necessary. As I mentioned earlier, I think that's hydrogen. It makes a lot of sense. So that's the direction that this company is taking, is constantly evolving the technology to acknowledge that it seems from our perspective that that's the direction that it's likely going to head, or at least a portion of it will head. And we want to be a part of that. So today we're an auxiliary device that acts like a catalytic converter of sorts on gas-fired heating appliances. In the future, we'll probably be a primary heating appliance that uses hydrogen as a heat plant. So its ultimate goal, though, is the ultimate complete decarbonation of the heating industry.
So from a return on investment point of view, if I'm a school or a business, is my return on investment only going to work if a government will subsidize me because I'm being a better, planetary citizen? Or does this still work, like 7 years, 10 years down the road where I actually get it paid for itself to install your system?
Absolutely. Carbon is in just about anything. So if you can find a meaningful and economic way of converting it from a gas into a solid, and that solid can then be used for a product, if there's margin there for it, then, and that was really kind of the whole premise of our business model, was we didn't want to be reliant on government subsidy to make this work. It had to stand on its own. And then when that happened, it was like a cherry on the cake.
And so, I mean, can you take advantage of government subsidy?
Totally. Absolutely. It's a little bit difficult right now just because those subsidies are largely meant still for large emitters, but I am seeing some traction for smaller scale applications. I think we're probably still another 4 or 5 years away where it will become more prevalent at this scale. But yeah, eventually, totally could be usable. The question is, who gets the credit? Does the utility get the credit? Does the customer get the credit? Do we get the credit? So there's a lot of unknown answers for where that's going to go.
So let's go to the positive byproduct here: the potassium carbonate, the soaps, the detergents. If I'm just a person watching right now and I'm like, I'd like to just buy these soaps, can I do that?
Sure can. Absolutely. We're scaling things up, so it's a little inefficient right now, but you can buy directly from our website, and we'll happy to ship you the soap. But the goal is to create a regional business model. So if you live in Los Angeles, there's a CarbonX unit in your neighborhood, and the carbon in the soap that you buy came from your region, not from halfway around the world. As I said, we're a startup, so we're not perfect yet, but that's the direction that we're taking, is to create regional business models that not only help reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but also create job growth opportunities, energy efficiency activities. So it's circular economy. One of the things that we love about the hotel industry is that we could take the carbon that we're capturing at the hotel, convert it into a cleaning good, and bring that back to the hotel to clean their surfaces. So then it's no longer just about greenhouse gas emission reductions and energy efficiency gains. It's about the circular economy of reusing this waste that you otherwise would have been venting to atmosphere.
All right, so let's talk from an investor point of view. You're a small startup. You're private right now. What are the plans for the future? Are there any ideas about crowdfunding down the road or seed rounds that I could get in on as an investor if I believe in what you're doing?
Sure. Yeah. Well, we're just closing up our current round. $3 million round. We're just on the tail end of it. I think we should have it closed out here in the next month or so. And then later this year, early next year, we'll probably do a Series A to focus on scale up. We're currently operating in Canada, the US, and Japan, and we have opportunities to expand into the European and UK markets as well as Australia. And that's going to take some help to get there. So that's what the Series A would be for.
Now, as an investor, one thing I worry about when a new company comes along is that they have a great idea, but then I'm like, oh, now that he's proven the idea, someone can come along and just copy you. So what would keep Jesse and I from just making a carbon Y machine or something?
Yeah. One, you need to be multifaceted. We're tied to multiple industries. Not only are we closely tied to the gas utilities who help support the deployment of this technology, we're also tied to the chemical industry, and we're well versed in production. On top of that, we have a pretty aggressive patent, both provisional as well as filed in Canada and the US and in the international arena as well. So we've dug a pretty deep moat around what we've created. But that's not to say that we couldn't get ripped off. I think that's inevitable. I mean, look at the smartphone industry, right? Apple was kind of the first one to come out with really the best smartphone, and now everybody and their dog has one. So in a way, one thing we need to bear in mind is that we're all trying to solve this big issue with climate change and carbon emissions. So obviously from an investment standpoint, we're, I think, pretty well established. But on the other hand, I would almost welcome some competition just because it's a big problem that we need to solve.
What about big companies like, I'm thinking like Train or something, if they came to you and said, hey, we'd like to license your technology, is that something you guys have thought about?
Yes, and they have.
That's okay. That's awesome.
Yeah.
That's great. Because I mean, I would imagine that that's money in the bank for you, and that's an expansion of this, proving this technology out.
Yeah, we have regular conversations with various industries that are looking at partnering with us, both from a license standpoint as well as from an onboarding perspective. So there's some really cool conversations that I can't dive into here, but yeah, we got some really big players at the table with us.
Okay, darn. I was going to ask, like, oh, so it's going to be a heating unit with a built-in carbon capture system, but you can't say anything? That's fine.
Now, you mentioned earlier that you have a next-gen unit, which is going to be even more efficient, it sounds like?
Mm-hmm. So right now we're at version 3.4s, which are designated for certain categories of gas-fired appliances. Next year, we'll be going into a new category of gas-fired appliance that condenses. So the more efficient a gas-fired appliance is, the more likely it is to create condensate. And that condensate kind of gums up the works for us. So we've retooled the system to not only increase the amount of carbonates that a unit can produce, but it can address the condensation that's associated with high-efficiency appliances. So yeah, that should be out probably end of Q1 of next year.
This is so cool. I feel like we co-run a company called Ecoware. You know, we're in the t-shirts and stuff. And I feel like we should be talking to you guys about like a branded soap. Because, I mean, talk about selling a product that's carbon negative. It's already carbon negative by its very nature. And I feel like people should be willing to pay a premium for something like that because, you know, people already do, right? We buy things that we're just proud to buy because we know they're good for the planet. And I feel like if I was buying a soap that was already carbon negative, like then it's already got properties that my regular soap doesn't have.
Yeah, well, I'd love to. We could chat about that and see if we can create something solid for you. Absolutely. One thing that we are also very mindful of with all of our personal care products, they're all natural. We don't use any palm or palm derivatives. I have personal dislike for palm. I hear, well, it's a sustainable palm factor. I'm like, well, so was the rainforest that was there before you mowed it over.
Exactly. And the orangutan that lived there.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So absolutely zero palm in any of our products. And we use natural. We don't use any artificial scents or artificial products in the soaps. It's all pretty natural stuff.
This has been so awesome talking to you. I told you so, Jesse. Huh? Right? When I found this out, I was like, this is going to be so much fun to talk to Jason.
Okay. I do have one thing that I want to ask. And it's for the investors. Because you were talking a little bit about the future and you were thinking that heating is going to move to hydrogen. And I don't think that I've heard that before. I think I've heard that with people talking about maybe cars. I know Toyota is thinking or thought that was going to be a thing. Are you thinking that we would basically flush out the natural gas pipelines that bring natural gas into our homes and replace that with hydrogen, or is it going to look different? I'm so curious.
It's the same, roughly the same infrastructure. The qualities of hydrogen are different. I think they've tested it. You can get up to about a 20% blend currently, without having a negative impact, but both the appliances as well as the piping that transmits the gas would have to be changed and upgraded, especially in the building where you have metal piping for your gas line in your house. So a lot of that would have to be changed out. But when you look at the cost comparison between changing out a pipeline going to your home that's transmitting hydrogen versus natural gas, and comparing that to the infrastructure needed to electrify, I think it's a little bit more challenging. Now, where we tend to get tripped up is in two areas: is timeline and in what market segment. When I talk about hydrogen, I'm largely talking about the retrofit market, and I'm largely talking about larger scale buildings, commercial buildings. I feel that the PV market and heat pump technology will probably advance sufficiently enough where the single detached market will make a lot of sense in certain regions. Other regions it may not. I think the overall comment here is that never in the history of heating have we ever relied on one energy source. So what works in California may not work in British Columbia or Alberta. So we may have multiple solutions for different regions, but as long as at the end of the day we're not producing any greenhouse gases, then what does it matter? Right? That's the ultimate goal of all of this, is to decarbonize.
I feel like you said earlier, if 4 to 5 years or some time period, governments actually catch on to this and start giving incentives. I mean, we're looking right now at the U.S. Senate has the HEATR Act in front of them, which is hopefully, if it gets passed, is going to give an incentive to the air conditioning industry to make heat pumps. If they were to do something similar here, where they were to give some kind of tax incentive to businesses to install your technology, I can see this really taking off.
Yeah. We have had some early stage discussions around that, and I think we'll get there. Yeah, I think there'll be some incentives that come down the road here in a relatively short period of time. But once again, we're kind of in that unique position where even if it doesn't, it still makes sense from an economic standpoint to install one of our systems.
This is so cool. I can't wait to check back with Jason in a year or two and see like what next rounds are available for investors, and to, talk to him about how the technology is going. Thank you so much for taking the time today, Jason, to talk to us.
I really appreciate you taking the time to chat with me as well.